Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, the 2023 Biennial Juried exhibition. This exhibition was juried by Dr. Melissa Crum, Yusuf Latif, and Jolene Powell. And today we are thrilled to present the artist, Jason Morgan. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. Feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the Q&A portion of the hour. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thank you in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks all, and welcome, Jason.
Hi, Kat. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Morgan, and I'd like to thank everybody for watching today. And I'd like to thank Kat and all of her team at the Rife Gallery for their support and for them making this presentation possible. And of course, the Ohio Arts Council for their part in that as well. I will get right into it, give a little bit of history about my life. Let's see. Good. There. I'm new to this, so everyone please bear with me. I was born in the mid-60s. I was raised in a tiny little town called Kirbyville in Texas. The main industry there was logging, and they did logging for lumber and lumber mills and paper mills. And these pictures are from the 70s and 80s when I grew up there. These are pictures. This is a picture of my extended family at a typical family gathering. There's my dad at the bottom with the pickup truck. He worked as in oil refineries as a carpenter and then later as a truck driver, but he was always a part-time musician. My mom mostly raised me and my two older brothers and a sister. And on the right there is a picture of my mom as a baby and my grandparents. There was not much art appreciation in the family or in the area, but there was lots of creativity. My dad started playing guitar when he was 8 years old, and he still plays at 85 years old. My older brother was a musician too. My mom's grandfather was the town photographer. You can see his calling card there at the bottom left. The rest of these are pictures of me growing up. Obviously, I was good at entertaining myself. So comic books were a big thing for me, superheroes. I also did a lot of model cars, and I played football early on. But when I would look at the comic books, I would a lot of times find myself studying the superheroes and how they were drawn. That was important to me, and I drew a lot of superheroes in my spare time. But another thing I did a lot of was looking around. There were lots of logging trucks in the area, of course. So that was one of the first things I learned to draw besides superheroes. The Beatles' White Album came out when I was very young, and that for some reason made a huge impression on me. I remember my brother listening to the music, and when I looked through the album, there were black and white photos of the band, and I set out to draw them. I drew them almost the same size as the photographs, and I was very concerned with getting it right, and I remember enjoying that process a lot. They didn't survive. The pictures didn't survive, so I can't show those to you. In my teens, my fascination with superheroes turned into the fascination with the band Kiss. I drew them a lot, and I also, as you see here, made my own costume for Halloween. And the bottom picture on the right is my grandmother's is example of how my grandmother's house looked. She had a lot of antiques and curiosities, and I spent a lot of time also looking at those things and exploring through those, all of her antiques. I think that helped form an eye for details and artistic things. In my late teens, I got interested in cars, and my natural mechanical ability came out because we were always working on them. Near the end of high school, I tried and got into a local college. I took one art class and didn't survive a semester in it. It just didn't, the whole thing of school didn't work for me. So the easy solution to that problem was, like everyone, I joined the military. And I chose the Marines most simply because they had the best looking uniforms. So I tried to enlist as a graphic artist. I didn't know you could do that until I got to the recruiter, and but they said I'd have to wait for 6 months to get that opening, and I wasn't willing to do that. So the next best choice was aircraft mechanic. So that's what I did while I was in there. After the military, I tried to get back into, or tried to get into the art field, but the best thing I could do was I worked in a photo lab at a mall developing pictures. I learned a lot about, I learned the first parts about developing film and photographs. Later, I got a job as a photo retoucher, and then a negative photo retoucher. Later on, I had a job as what they called a color mixing tech at a paint store. But that they taught me how to mix color there. That was the first time anyone had done that. None of this was formal training, but I felt like it was the first training in art that I had. The next job I got was in a graphic art department for a company that made collectible beer steins. There I started out at the bottom, and I learned more photography and more film development, and also learned how to do paste ups, which is old school graphic art before computers. There were illustrators there who I watched paint scenes for the beer steins, and they kind of showed me the ropes of how painting is done. Later on, I attempted some of my own, and eventually I got good enough to use some of those illustrations in products. These photographs are beer steins that have my art on them. I worked there, did that for about 5 years. And somewhere in there, we learned how to do graphic art on computers, and then I moved to Ohio. Once I got to Ohio, I was able to get a job as a graphic artist on a computer for a package design firm. And I mostly did layout for product labels. It was tedious. It required lots of organization and attention to detail, but it wasn't very creative. I worked there for about 5 more years, but then I started to get restless. And about that time, I met Margaret, who's my wife, or is now my wife, and she started there as a comp artist. She would do the mock-ups of the products using the labels that we would produce. I showed her some of my very early portraits. The one on the left is probably one of the first ones I ever did. She was excited and impressed with what I could do, I think, and I convinced her to marry me, and we ran away to Texas with our kids, and we blended our families and I started a new career as an artist, trying to just paint for a living. From the start, she helped me in every way to create the best work that I could do and to learn how to run a business. We moved back to my hometown, and the only reason I could make a living as an artist in the beginning was because the cost of living was so dirt cheap. We lived in a tiny trailer house, and it was very hard, but we made the best of it. We scrimped and saved and did everything on the cheap as best we could. I even used an outbuilding at my brother's house as a studio, and you can see that here. This is where I think my military training in organization and perseverance really helped a lot. I set up a regular daily painting schedule. Like I would just leave the home and go to the outbuilding like it was a job. I would paint just about anything I could get paid for. And one of the first commissions I ever received was with my mom's help. A friend of hers wanted a portrait done of her new grandson, and that's it on the left. She gave me a tiny photograph to work from, but I knew it was critical that I do the best that I could so that we could get paid. It was exciting that when it was done, I think it turned out pretty good, but it was exciting that I had paid all of our bills for the month with that painting. Now the bills weren't very much, but that was still a lot. So I used that painting to get more work, more portraits and a few other kinds of things. So I put together a portfolio of the work that I'd done, including that painting, and I took it around to all the places nearby, nearby towns and cities. And I was just pitching custom artwork to anybody that seemed like they would want that kind of thing. Designers, painters, architects, that kind of thing. Eventually, I started getting calls for work. And as you can see here, I painted all different kinds of things. One interior designer needed some paintings for a client who loved old masters paintings. He wanted fine art, but without having to pay too much for it. So they enlisted me to basically reproduce some old Italian paintings for his house. At the time, it was very good money and it was really needed. So I was happy to do it. The bonus was that I got to copy great paintings. This was the start of the real great training of how to paint. The largest one was this one. It was 5 feet by 8 feet, and it took a very long time to do. But it was there that I realized I liked painting large. It gave me the idea to add murals to my services of painting. And so I put an ad in the local paper for murals. And the first call for the job was painting a ceiling to look like the night sky in this guy's house he was building. I think I was as surprised as he was that I had pulled it off. So this gave me the courage to take on a public mural in the downtown area. A friend had suggested doing this, and so we collected photographs from a local photographer from a long time ago, and I didn't have easy access to the internet at the time. It was kind of just beginning, so there were no tutorials or how to do things like there is nowadays. You can just go online and figure out how to do things. I had to figure this out for myself. My nephew helped with this mural. We had scaffolding set up, and he helped do some of the outlining and taping and drawing and things like that. But I realized I wasn't very good at delegating the work, so I've kind of worked by myself ever since then. It's simpler for me. With another mural under my belt, my mother-in-law in Ohio hired me to enhance her office entrance. She wanted it to look like an old Italian villa. So I did up this design and spent about a month or so painting that in Ohio, and while we still lived in Texas. But it got such a positive response from the communities that we thought it prompted us to move back to Ohio. So we did that, and more murals came out of that. I've done murals all around Southwest Ohio. I learned a lot about how to work outside in the elements, how to use large equipment like a boom lift or scissors lift. But the biggest takeaway from the murals was learning how to scale that work up, because it all starts the same way, and then it's just a matter of how big your canvas is. The question I get the most from onlookers while I'm doing a mural is, how do you work on such a scale? So I tell them I learned to compartmentalize the process. I break it down into steps like design and layout and projecting, and then outlining. Then painting one small section at a time. here you can see close-ups. It's hard to get a good shot of a mural while you're painting it, so they're okay. So I'd work on one element in the design. I'd usually start that day by deciding where I was going to work and what the goal was for that day. Like I wanted to finish one figure or one section of the mural, and I would that compelled me to get to work as fast as I could, so that I could finish that part by the end of the day. And that helped me learn roughly how long a mural would take by how many elements I thought I could get done in one day. So that's a very quick part of that, or explanation of that. So when I'm not working on murals at the time, I would work on commissioned portraits. This was early 2000s, and the murals and portraits were steady and made up all of my painting work. As with most of my paintings, I preferred to work from reference photos, as you can see what I'm doing here in this picture. Excuse me. I really love doing portraits. Achieving the likeness is the challenge, but the reward is the happy clients. I've had a rule all along that a portrait is not done until it looks like the person that the client knows, meaning it has to look like the photograph, but I then show that painting to the client, and then I listen to what they say doesn't look quite right. If they think something should be changed, then I just change it. I don't want them to be happy. I want them to be happy, and it's not about me or how I want the image to look. Because I imagine most of the portraits that I do, or I hope that most of the portraits I do will be family heirlooms, so they'll hopefully be around for many years. So it's got to be right. This was my first influence, Norman Rockwell. I've been loving his work since I was a kid. I love the nostalgia aspect of it, his ability to capture the realism in his subjects, and also to creating a story. I think that definitely influenced my later still life paintings, which we'll get into. These pictures are from when we went to the Norman Rockwell Museum, which I would wholeheartedly encourage you to go if you're interested. I loved seeing his studio, and I loved learning that he used a projector among other tools in his painting process. It was very validating, and I wholeheartedly incorporated that into the work after learning that, because I've always kind of felt like it was cheating a little bit, but it turned out if he can use it, I can use it. Since I wasn't formally trained to paint, everything I've learned about art, I learned on my own, or from asking people around me who knew something about art or more creative than I was. When I was a kid, my family had this board game called Masterpiece. I never liked playing the game, but I loved the cards that came in it. They were images of paintings in museums from all over the world. And probably my first exposure to that kind of higher level art. So this painting from the game on the left really got my attention. I can't say exactly why, but I remembered it my whole life. And recently I came across it when we went to visit the Art Institute of Chicago, and I was blown away by the memory of it from the game. It's surprised to see it in person. I now realize that the influence of some of these pieces of work on my work, and so we've got here my painting next to that painting, The Rock, and I think you can see the influence there, but I didn't know I was doing it, so that's pretty cool. Another influence is obviously Rembrandt. I can't say while I'm composing these objects for a painting, a still life painting, that I'm intentionally thinking of these influences, but when you see their work next to mine, it seems pretty obvious that it's all made a big impression on me. You notice the lighting is similar, the point of view, meaning like the perspective is similar, and the background is kind of a takeoff on that. Another influence was John Singer Sargent, where I feel like I've incorporated some of the composition and the chiaroscuro, the dark and light aspects of it to enhance the scene. Again, not Norman Rockwell. He was apparently influenced by Rembrandt. The lighting, again, was specifically strong from above in both these images. But I also realized that both these images have dramatic stage lighting. Like, it's very theatrical, and that's just always appealed to me. And I wonder if this is where it came from. So as a result of the recession several years ago, the portrait and mural commissions dried up. And a gallery owner in Yellow Springs, Ohio, suggested I try something different. So like still lifes. And I thought, I don't want to do still lifes. Who's interested in still life? Who needs it? The world doesn't need another still life painting. But she kept encouraging me, and I thought, well, if I can make it interesting to me, it would be worthwhile. And, you know, if it's not the size of a mural, or if it's not a portrait, where would the challenge be? So my thought was to take a classic still life subject and try to make it more dramatic and more interesting to me, so that other people will see that. And this orange pepper, was the first painting to do that, where I did that. So the more I worked on this idea, I realized I really liked dramatic lighting and a low camera angle. The challenge came with combining the interesting textures and reflections into the painting. The gallery owner, we showed some of these to her, and the gallery owner asked me if I could do enough for a whole show. So I did a few more. As I got more complicated, or got more into it during this process, Margaret started helping me come up with compositions. She had photos from college of little tablescapes she made, arranging objects so that they seemed to interact with each other, creating a scene. This brought back my memories of wandering through my grandma's curiosities. I loved looking very closely at the intricacies of these things that she had. And so the whole experience was starting to get interesting. Together, we started playing around with little objects. We had objects we had, experimenting with the lighting and the composition and with the storytelling. Here you see her playing with things, and I'm obviously taking the picture. The result was pretty exciting, so that kept us going. And those early experiments with objects and textures led to the rest of the paintings, and these made up the first still life show. And we called it the Painted Table because the stage that all these objects were on for every piece was a cutting board, and being roughly food oriented, it kind of made sense to call it the Painted Table. Excuse me. The notice for that show that we sent out went to galleries all over Ohio, and Michelle from Brant Roberts in Columbus came to see it. She was excited about the work and became interested in handling the still life work. So this was a great turning point. And I've been painting for her gallery ever since, and that's been over 10 years now. Initially, the paintings were mostly dark backgrounds. The focus was on dramatic lighting, adding any interesting object I could find to make it interesting. Usually incorporating something organic like fruit or vegetable or plant, but always having something shiny or something with an unusual texture. Over time, the compositions got more complicated and the paintings got larger. I started experimenting with complex backgrounds and more depth, putting in images from other paintings behind the subjects so that it created a whole new scene. Was a surprise. And it was also interesting to try to make them, as they got bigger, to seem more abstract without losing the realism. I found that very interesting. So everywhere we go, we're always looking for trinkets, objects, things that are interesting to look at, and I'm always buying things that we have a budget for that. So this is part of our little collection. The studio, my studio is a spare bedroom in our house. I used to have an old wooden easel that we acquired from a local college, but I recently found a more modern steel one that moves around, easier to move a canvas around on. I can slide it up and down and left to right very easily. And it's counterbalanced, and that helps keep the muscle spasms at bay because I tend to clench up when I'm painting a lot. I always use artificial light. It's consistent, and I like that I can paint at any time of the day. And I used to print out hard copies of photos that I would paint from as my reference, but eventually I learned that using an iPad was much easier. And I've always listened to audiobooks while I paint. And sometimes when the work gets hard, the story is what keeps me coming back to the painting. So they're very important. As for the paint, I've always used acrylic. I tried oils in the beginning, and I didn't have anyone teaching me how to use them, so I was confused by it all. So I stuck with acrylics. I buy them in large buckets for the murals, and that usually is enough to keep me going with still life paintings. It's a very high quality, and it's very economical that way. I generally only use primary colors, but occasionally I'll throw in a magenta or another blue or maybe another yellow, but mostly the primary colors. I mix them as I go. I spend a lot of time color matching, and the palette that I use, you can see there, uses a paper. It's paper with a sponge underneath it, and that keeps the paint from drying out. It's a fantastic tool for acrylic paint. I've used it for years. The brushes I use are almost always natural bristle brushes, and I usually wear them down to nubs on the canvas using the dry brush technique that I seem to always go back to. At the gallery's request, I started doing some still life commissions. These are using a client's personal objects, not things that I choose. They bring me a collection of things, and I choose from those what to put in the painting or in the composition. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to make interesting compositions, because I don't have much of a connection to these objects, but I persevere and usually come up with something interesting. And sometimes the challenge can be very satisfying. It's kind of like, I think of them as a portrait of the person who commissioned it, but through their objects, using their objects instead of their face. There's a quote that I like: "The things that we cherish define us." And that, I think, applies to taking all these objects and making a portrait of the person out of them. And the largest still life commission I've done so far is for the Columbus Metropolitan Library. They didn't have any of their own items, but they liked this figurine, but they had a particular idea that they wanted it to look like. So using this figurine, and they had a certain size, and they wanted a certain mood in the painting. But it was too big to paint in my home studio, so I had to borrow space from a local college, and they had higher ceilings. And here is the finished piece hanging in the lobby of the new library in Gahanna, Ohio. I was very proud of that painting. So So the process starts with photography. It's the same whether I'm doing a commission or it's an original for myself. I start with the items of interest. I'm looking for shiny things, unusual textures, colors. Try to avoid dull textures, but not always. Sometimes it's necessary. The commission challenge here was that they wanted in this photograph of the objects, there's a photograph of a living room with a window and a view out the window of Chicago. So they wanted that photograph in the painting somehow. So using a photo is sometimes difficult. So I start by just arranging the objects, staging them, and I try to make them appear like they're interacting if possible, play around with the different surfaces. They even change the background and what the objects are setting on sometimes, and looking for different colors and reflections. So this was the photograph that they wanted, and this was the first of many tries to get that photograph in the composition and make it look engaging. But I'm also trying to bring out the best features of each object. This was the first attempt that was somewhat good to get that photograph in there. But then I had the idea to scan that image and tone it to some different colors. I tried other colors, but ended up with the blue. And I put that scanned photograph on my monitor, on my desktop. And then I staged all these objects in front of that monitor. So it appeared as if these objects were sitting in that apartment with that in front of that window. That was a lot of fun. And so this ended up being the composition that the client liked, but they weren't too crazy about the photograph being there, which I agreed. So, but they chose this composition, but they wanted the blue background behind it. And this is where the graphic art background helps. A lot of times I have to do photo editing, merging things together, deleting parts of the image, making all kinds of tweaks. And this is the final photo reference that I ended up painting from. And so here I'll show you the contact sheet to give you an idea of how many photos that I take for one final piece. There's almost 300 images here. That's not unusual. Sometimes I've taken up into the over 1,000. You can kind of see many compositions, just trying different lighting and different positions. I'm not really looking for a single perfect picture because I can always merge in photo editing. But I'm looking for strong compositions so that I can show the client. Narrowing it down is the first step by eliminating everything that's blurry or the lighting is terrible. I just delete all those first. And then we get a little further into it. And I'm weeding out things that are too extreme or too fussy or maybe even too simple. And here I'm starting to get really close. You can see the two photographs on the left are the right composition that the client ended up liking. I'm looking for dramatic lighting. I'm looking for mood, subject interaction. That's really important also. So here we finally get to the painting process. It begins by projecting that image that they approved or they wanted onto a canvas. And projecting takes a little getting used to. It's a little disorienting when you're standing up close to the thing and the image is being projected over your shoulder. And I used to use pencils to draw the lines on the canvas, but they tended to smear a lot, so I use grease pencils now. And it's the same process for the murals. In the murals, it's just larger, and I used to have a lift to get up onto the side of the wall, the building, to outline it. So that's a little more complicated, but it's the same thing, same process. I tried using smooth panels to paint on at one time, but I ended up going back to the canvases. I like the texture of the canvas, and that tends to lend itself to the dry brush technique. Here's I think it's almost completely outlined, but the image is still being projected on it. And here is just the outlined image without the projection. And it usually takes about an hour or two to do all this. It's quite tedious. That's where the audiobooks help a lot too. So the first and next step is painting. I'm just roughing in the background. I work from the back of the image to the front of the image, and usually from dark to light. So that's just roughing in. And more background work here. Not much else to say there. I start with the upper background, and it's mostly completed in this image, but I'm making progress. I save the most complicated areas to last. Same with the portraits. I'll do the background first, and then the body, and then the face I save for last because it's the most interesting and the most challenging. So here I'm saving the flowers and the other objects to last. I work my way down here to the lower background, the surface that everything is sitting on. In the darker areas, I'm trying not to get too much into the details right now. And then I get more into the details. Finishing up the lower background, I get into painting the objects, the first of the objects. I try to keep the iPad next to the object that I'm painting while I'm painting it, and I try to enlarge that object to the same size so that my eye can go back and forth more easily. And each object usually takes a few days to complete. Like I'll work on that one object until it's finished before moving on to the next. So it's kind of compartmentalized. I think of it kind of like putting a puzzle together. Here, getting very close to completion. I think the only thing that's not done here is the little snake bracelet and part of the hand. And as you can see, that's kind of in the foreground of the composition. So that, to me, that's the last part. This challenge here is, at this point, is to make sure that the objects look connected to each other, or like they're sitting with each other. I don't want them to appear as if they've been cut and pasted on top of each other. So the last part is the highlights. I like them to be bright and crisp. It enhances the sense of depth as much as possible. Lots of times, I spend a lot of time on the final tweaks. And then Margaret comes in and she looks at it with fresh eyes and gives me all the feedback I need. Because I can tend to get very hyper-focused on the details and just completely overlook something that's obviously not right in the painting process. So then we show it to the client. When we both agree, then we show it to the client. And if they love it, then it's done. I will then go in and put 2 or 3 coats of clear varnish over the top of that to kind of protect it, and it makes it look nice and shiny. So all that was an expanded view of the whole entire process, beginning to end. Here's an edited version of the painting Afterland, which is currently in the Biennial exhibit at the Rife Gallery. Started out with this composition, photographing it. Wait a minute, did I do that right? Yeah. I started out with this one, and I just wanted to paint the grapes. When I added the gold airplane, I felt like it was something interesting was happening. I had this question, could I make the grapes appear like a cloud? I thought that would be fun. And could I make the airplane burst out of that cloud? What else could I put in there? I had to get a prop to hold the airplane in position. Initially I thought I would eliminate that I would keep that clip in the painting, but as you'll see, eventually it got eliminated. So I played around with more objects. Usually 3 or 4 in a composition work well. This is always part of the process. Try different positions, different options to see what works best. The little Eiffel Tower object just didn't seem to cut the mustard, as they say. This blue crystal monolith really lit things up when I put that in there, and that was exciting, I thought. So that kept me going. And then it's kind of just moving things around, moving the lighting around. Sometimes that's all it takes, is the great lighting. When I adjusted the light to directly overhead, it really started to come together. And this was another case of pulling parts from different images to make a composite. The grapes came from one image. The details of the airplane came from a couple of different images. And the blue crystal was there, but I enhanced the color of it. And as always, the audiobook is nearby to keep me coming back to it. So at this point, I felt like I was getting there, almost done, but something was missing. I wanted more depth in the background. It was around this time, it was 4th of July, and there were fireworks outside our studio window. So looking through some of the photos of that night of the fireworks, we came across this scene and got really excited. I wanted to see if it would work as a background for this painting to give it more interest. So I projected it onto the painting. I outlined it in white. And once I started painting it in, I realized it was very compelling. Here you can see I'm painting it in from the left behind the grapes. And I've gone about halfway across, and on the right, next to the airplane's wingtip, you can see the outline of where the tree line is. And here is the finished piece. I think adding the exterior landscape as a background really helps set this piece apart. It helps to enhance the sense of emotion and energy that's created by the appearance of the airplane coming out of this cloud burst of grapes. I started the painting in May 2020 and finished it sometime in July. And there was a lot of uncertainty at the time in the world, anxiety about the future for me. And when I finished the painting, we came across a novel called Afterland. And when we heard that title, it seemed to really breathe life into the painting. And that's when I knew it was finished. For me, the general feeling of the painting is hope for the future. And that is everything I know.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank
Folks,
you.
if you have any questions, pop them into the chat. I already have a couple of questions that I'm going to prime with. So the first thing I like to ask, if possible, is about your studio practice. Can you kind of set the stage for what do you have any rituals? Do you have anything that like clearly sets this? Are you an early morning person? Is it the first thing you do? Like, tell us a little bit about your daily studio practice, if it is daily, and all of that kind of good stuff.
Very good question. It is generally daily. I try to work normal hours. Margaret has a day job that she goes to, so I'm trying to work while she's at work, and then we can both be off work when I'm done. That doesn't always happen. I'm not an early riser, so I don't get started as early as I would like to. And actually starting at the beginning of a painting is really the hardest part. Even though I've got it drawn out, I know what I'm going to paint, something about putting that first paint on the canvas is a challenge. I don't really know why, but I've learned over the years that if I just pick up some paint and put it on there and start pushing the paint around on the canvas, then that's what gets me going. I'll generally try to work 6 to 8 hours a day on a painting. but since I work for myself, I can take breaks whenever I want. So that's nice. And I will usually only work on one painting at a time. I don't, and usually when that painting's done, it goes away either to a client or to the gallery, and I just start the next one. Did that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's great. And so we have a question. You seem to have taken a lot away from past jobs, such as paint mixing, graphic design, composition, photography. What do you think was the best lesson from all those jobs?
Wow, good question. What was the best? Like, what was the best thing that I learned from one of those jobs?
I think that
Um,
you can take it whichever way you like.
I think um, work ethic, knowing that other people are just working every day and this is my job, so I have to do that. And I think specifically color mixing. Um, I I've worked so much on color mixing, and that first paint mixing job was where I learned the basics of that.
Great. So, which Norman Rockwell stood out to you the most as a child, and has your view of it changed looking at it as an adult?
Oh gosh. I don't think I have one specifically. There were so many that I just loved. Actually, probably the classic one of him at his easel painting a triple self portrait or doing a self portrait. That was probably made the biggest impression at first. But really, after I was an adult and went to see some of his work in person, it doesn't hold a candle to what you see in the magazines or print or even online. The work in person is just stunningly beautiful, just as art, whether you like his work or not. His ability is outstanding.
So another thing that we haven't had a moment to mention, but we have a lobby exhibition up right now as well through the Ohio Department of Veteran Services. They have a veterans juried exhibition, and you also have a piece in that. So you have a piece in two juried exhibitions, which that's pretty special.
I think so. I feel very honored, and it's always wonderful when I can get people to, get my work in front of people. And that painting in particular is a tiny one that I did. I don't usually do very small paintings, and it actually has Margaret in it as well
Yeah, what a
as the
treat.
subject.
It's very nice. When you come to
Thank you.
see the show in the gallery, you should also make sure that you see the show outside of the gallery. So we have another question. What is the best trinket you found for a still life that, like, when you saw, you instantly said, I have to have that?
um, I think the first one that comes to mind is that chrome balloon dog, which is a figurine made after the famous Jeff Koons balloon dog sculptures. As soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, we've got to put that in a painting. But it happens all the time. There's so many times I'm like, this is a must. But that's the first thing that comes to mind.
We have a question from Don who said that he enjoyed your earlier works with the beer steins and is curious if you're still experimenting with that type of work.
I guess you could say yes. I do always. I kind of dabble with the idea of doing landscapes. I keep photographs of images that I've taken or that I've seen, and I keep a little file in the computer where they're just paint images that I think would make beautiful landscapes. Those things that I painted then were sort of landscapes, but there was a specific reason for the objects in them. But the ones I'd like to be doing at some point in the future in my spare time are just beautiful landscapes of unusual places.
Great. We have another question from Candace. Now, you have answered a bit of this within the talk, but I think maybe she's asking for something a little bit different. She asked, how has your art evolved over time and what motivates that evolution? Now, you shared with us that you had to evolve from your mural painting and portrait painting during the recession, just because that it dried up, and that so you pointed at the kind of urging of a gallery owner to still life. But perhaps you can dial in a little bit more on subject and how your art has evolved around subject, maybe?
I think so. I just always, like I said, I always go back to, I just love looking at the intricacies of things. And I just want to show other people through the art what I see in those things, what I think makes them beautiful. So that's really what compels me to choose an object or to do a painting of it. I just love making it seem larger than life, sometimes literally, but also figuratively. I also like making it seem dramatic, like a superhero. So I like doing that, but lately, as I mentioned briefly, I want it to be more. I wanted the images to go more towards abstract, but I don't want them to. I don't want the paint to be literally abstract. I want the composition and the image to be so interesting and complicated that it becomes like an abstract image, but with hyper realism. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Langston would like to know, what's a painting style or genre that you've never tried but always wanted to?
Something I've never tried. I think I've tried just about everything I've wanted to, but I'm not good at all of them. Some of the things I've tried ended up not being very, not good enough for me at least. I like figurative work, and that is something that I have not been able to make work to my satisfaction. So I think I'll go back to that at some point.
And so this piece that we're looking at, Afterland, right now, when you do come to the gallery to see it, you'll see it really is a grand scale. Like, if these grapes were this large in real life, they'd be as big as a cantaloupe or a volleyball. And it's just so fun to imagine grapes on that scale. So we'll close out with this question. For folks that are stepping into or are at the beginning or maybe the middle of their art trajectory and are trying to find their footing, what is your best piece of advice to keep going, to continue to be inspired? And
that's a very good question. I think that's pretty easy for me, at least. Perseverance is a big part of it. You got to paint all the time. You got to keep doing it, and the more you paint, the better you'll get, and the more you will have to show people. Also, find something that's interesting to you. You can't paint what someone else thinks is great. You got to be interested in it for it to be good. That's very critical. Oh, and one more thing. I had a curator at a museum early on in Texas where I showed him some of my work. And the first thing he said when I showed him my paintings was, "You're using cheap paint, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." "How could you tell?" He said, "I can just tell." So buy the best paint you can afford is my advice, because it makes a difference.
All right. So There you have it. Thank you again, Jason, for the generosity of your time and talent. And thank you all for joining us for this artist talk by Jason Morgan as a part of our programming for the 2023 Biennial Juried exhibition. I'd like to give a special thank you to the jurors, Dr. Melissa Crum, Yusuf Latif, and Jolene Powell. And a big thank you to all our other participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council Board, the Ohio Legislature, and the Governor, who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.